Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. My guest today is Professor David Papineau. So welcome, David.
I'm very glad to be here. This is fun.
So David, you are a professor of philosophy at the CUNY Graduate Center and also at King's College London, right?
That's right. I do the spring semester here and the fall semester in London.
Okay. Right. And you, before getting into the meat of what I want to talk to you about, you recently published a book about sports and philosophy. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm glad you said it's about sports and philosophy, because it's not really conventional philosophy of sport. I mean, that's a well-established area, and it looks at a lot of interesting issues to do with the kind of ethics of sport and doping and enhancement and professionalization, the economics of sport and so on. But I just wanted to I'm a big sports fan, and I got lots of ideas about sport. Most of them are kind of got a philosophical slant, because I'm a philosopher and I think about things philosophically. So, and it's just to run through a bunch of different topics. They aren't conventional philosophy of sport topics. I kind of talk about how do you hit a ball when you only got half a second. What's the status of the rules in sport? Should you obey them? There's quite a lot of kind of social philosophy about citizenship and identity and race, and there's quite a lot about altruism and cooperation and team thinking, and kind of I relate that all to issues in philosophy of biology. So it's just a bunch of kind of topics that I got interested in, and I had fun doing it. Have you read the book? Have you looked at it?
I have not. No, I looked at the summary of it. It sounded interesting. It sounded like something I hadn't seen before, so I figured I'd ask you about it.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. I mean, it kind of weaves in quite a bit of serious philosophy alongside just kind of telling sporting anecdotes and stories about myself and so on.
Now, prior to doing this book,
it's not a philosophy book. It's aimed at a general audience. So 2 reviewers of the book independently said, "Well, this book's a lot of fun. It's kind of high-toned bar talk," and I was actually pleased. That's exactly what I was setting out to do. So,
yeah. It seems like a fun book. So prior to doing that book, what has been what have been the focuses of your philosophical career?
That's a kind of difficult question. I guess I've changed quite a lot in my focus. I started off worrying about objectivity in science and Kuhn and Feyerabend, that kind of thing, philosophy of science, and then I got interested in issues of meaning and representation as a result of that. And then somehow I got more interested in metaphysical issues to do with the mind. I mean, that was partly to do with getting interested in representation. I did a lot of work on consciousness, mind-brain issues. I've always had a long-standing interest in causation, the structure of causation, the way that causal relationships relate to probabilistic relationships. So I guess didn't expect you to ask that. What are the themes of my philosophy? I guess mental representation, consciousness, causation. I guess those are the issues that now at the moment I think of myself as involved in. Mm-hmm. And I've ended up, for better or worse, doing quite a lot of metaphilosophy. What's the nature of philosophy? But I was brought up not to do that. I was brought up, Hugh Mellor, my old teacher, used to say, "Don't talk about philosophy, just do it." And somehow, despite that, I've ended up last 10 years maybe writing half a dozen papers or more on the nature of philosophy. So that's something I've been working on, but I'm kind of not proud of that. I'm happy to. I've decided to stop doing it for the time being.
I won't ask you to continue on that topic then. So one of the big things I want to talk to you about is naturalism. So you've written a lot about naturalism, and it's a topic that really interests me. So I want to ask you first to give a basic account of what naturalism is, and in particular, can you help me kind of distinguish it from related terms such as physicalism and materialism?
Okay. So I think this is a mug's game, actually, trying to define what naturalism is. I'm going to answer your question in a minute, but I've tried. I mean, I've written things about naturalism, and sometimes I sat down. Okay, I'm going to decide what's naturalism. But the trouble is, just about all contemporary English-speaking philosophers want to say they're naturalists. Somehow, naturalism is kind of a plus word, and few people explicitly want to say I'm an anti-naturalist. So I don't know, philosophers like John McDowell and David Chalmers. I mean, they'd say we're naturalists. We're naturalists, even though a lot of their doctrines are kind of down the non-naturalist end. So I think there's a kind of spectrum of positions, and trying to define where you stop being a naturalist and become not a naturalist, it's not worth trying to do that. But let me say something else. Let me say something positive about what it is. So I think we need to distinguish two pretty different things that go under the heading of naturalism. And sometimes this is called ontological naturalism and methodological naturalism. And they're both kind of a bit sciencey, but methodological naturalism is about the nature of philosophical inquiry, and it's the idea that philosophy and science aren't really in very different lines of business. And I mean, there's obviously some differences between philosophy and science. I mean, philosophers don't typically do experiments or gather data, but a lot of philosophers, naturalist philosophers, will say, nevertheless, we're in the business of constructing perhaps very general, but theories of the world that aren't just a matter of conceptual analysis. They're substantial synthetic theories, and in the end, they're to be defended, if at all, by appealing to a posteriori evidence about what we observe in the world. So there's a view about it's a view about philosophical method. So as I said a moment ago, before you asked this question, I got involved in metaphilosophy, the nature of philosophy, and methodological naturalism is a doctrine in that area. It's a metaphilosophical doctrine about what's the nature of philosophical investigation. So that's one side of it. And the other side of it is what I said was ontological naturalism, and that's more to do with views about the nature of the world, what's in the world. And an ontological naturalist will, roughly speaking, say there's nothing kind of supernatural or spooky. What's in the world are just entities discovered to be there by natural science, and that's the side of naturalism that you might wonder, well, how is that different from physicalism or materialism? So, but just before we go on to that, so I said there's methodological naturalism, philosophies in the same business of science, and then there's ontological naturalism. There's no kind of spooky or mysterious or supernatural entities in the world, and that's just a very vague way of characterizing the two kinds of naturalism. If you wanted me to be more precise and say, well, give me a precise definition so you can tell me whether, say, I don't know, Christine Korsgaard is a naturalist, I wouldn't want to do that. What I want to say is, look, here's a bunch of doctrines. Some of them are more kind of tight and extreme in the ontological or methodological naturalist direction, and we can look at arguments to see how far we should go in either of those two directions. But defining the cutoff point seems to me not a particularly useful thing to do.
Yeah, that's fair.
I
think that's a good starting point. I realize that. I
haven't asked your question about materialism and physicalism, but let's leave that on the table. You tell us what to do next.
Yeah, no, I mean it's. I think this is something that I've noticed comes up in a lot of areas in philosophy, where if you try to define something too precisely, you end up defining something that isn't really that subject matter, and you've sort of you've made it more precise than that subject matter really is.
You can end up arguing about what's naturalism. I mean, if somebody's epiphenomenalist in the philosophy of mind, does that disqualify them as a naturalist? And after a while, you think, why are we worrying about this? Why is this a serious question? If somebody's an epiphenomenalist and wants to call themselves a naturalist, why should I want to fight about that? I mean, I'll fight about whether epiphenomenalism is a serious position, but not about whether somebody who embraces it is or is not entitled to call himself a naturalist. That seems to me not worth spending a lot of energy on.
Yeah. So let's go to what you called ontological naturalism. That's a bit more what I'm interested in. It seems like, in the way you described it, and other things that I've seen, that you can kind of define it in two ways. One, which is something like, what exists is roughly the physical world, or as you said, there aren't kind of spooky supernatural things. And another way, more in relation to science, not as method, but sort of just what exists are those things that science tells us about, and without being too specific about what those things are.
Yeah, sorry, you're saying that's the ontological and the methodological one.
Well, I'm saying, I guess my question is whether you can view, it seems to me like you can view the ontological one in either of two ways. You can say the things that exist are the physical things, or the things that exist are the things that science tells us about. And roughly, I guess you would think that those would coincide, but they're not exactly the same position.
Sure, but I'd be uneasy about making ontological naturalism a matter of deference to science. I mean, I agree that when I describe it, I said, the kind of things that are revealed by science. But I mean, it's not the idea that science, because the people doing it all wear white coats, has some kind of authority and we ought to listen to what they say. I mean, we can bypass all that. The interesting thing is, what does the evidence indicate about the nature of reality? And ontological naturalists will be people who say the evidence shows strongly that reality only contains certain kinds of entities, not supernatural, not spooky, and so on. Does it show that it only contains physical entities, material entities? We can get into some very fine-tuned debates, which you might want to look at, about what does physical mean in this context. Well,
here's perhaps what I haven't.
Suppose there was a vital force, but suppose it was a pretty kind of scientifically tractable kind of force. You could write down a force law, it obeyed the conservation of energy, but it was peculiar to living bodies and it accounted for some of the peculiar features of living bodies. Would that be consistent with physicalism or not? I mean, some people think that would be in the spirit of physicalism, nothing spooky, everything is governed by precise force laws, no kind of spontaneous, special kind of causation. But other people say, look, it's not physicalism, because physicalism means all we have in reality are the kinds of things we find outside living bodies, in kind of stones and rocks and things like that. And I start to feel sometimes that there's about that like I do about naturalism. I mean, do we want to fight about what's the definition of physicalism? The interesting question is, are there any vital forces? Or does everything reduce or get constituted by things that don't involve vital forces? Again, we don't want to get bogged down in the definitional issues.
Well, let me then ask you something a bit more substantial. As a naturalist yourself,
yeah,
what is your approach to entities like abstract objects, properties, things of this sort?
That's a complicated question. I don't take properties to be in the same box as abstract objects like numbers. Abstract objects like numbers, they're kind of outside space and time. They have no causal role in the scheme of things. Properties, I think of properties as universals. I think they get together with objects, typically spatiotemporal objects, to constitute facts. Facts are the kind of things that get involved in causal relationships. You can call the facts states of affairs if you like. Some people don't want to call them facts, but states of affairs. I mean, and I think properties are things in the world. My ontological naturalism doesn't make me want to dismiss properties at all. But abstract objects like numbers and sets, say, they're different because they're outside the spatiotemporal causal realm, and that raises a lot of difficulties about, if they did exist, how could we get to know about them? And so if you're generally an ontological naturalist and think that the only things that can have effects in the natural world, in the spatiotemporal world, are the things recognized as doing such, evidenced as doing such by science, then you'll conclude that numbers and sets don't have any effects. And in fact, most philosophers are very happy to agree about that.
Happy to agree that they don't have effects.
They don't have any effects. I mean, they don't all agree that shows that they don't exist. But the problem of people who say they do exist is explaining how we get to know about them, how our beliefs about them get to line up with the facts about them. So I'm quite attracted to a fictionalist view about numbers and sets, that it's very helpful to doing all kinds of calculations to imagine such things exist, relate them to things in the spatiotemporal world, figure out other conclusions about the spatiotemporal world via this mapping into the numbers. But in order for that to be useful, you don't have to think the numbers actually exist.
I see.
I mean, the trouble is, so how? I mean, similar issues arise in the moral realm, but some people think of numbers, sets, moral properties, moral facts as existing outside the spatiotemporal realm, and then they posit some kind of power of intuition to account for our knowledge of them. But that doesn't really deal with the problem. I mean, even after you posited the power of intuition, there's going to be this question about, well, at some point, the deliverances of intuition are going to make a difference in the spatiotemporal world, presumably by affecting what we think and what we say. But if the input to them is unable to have any effects in the spatiotemporal world, then how does the existence of these numbers, sets, moral facts make any difference to what we think and say?
Right. So if you were able to grab onto them via our intuitions, then in some sense they must be affecting our intuition, which means that
and
they
that
would
is
then affecting.
with something we haven't talked about. I mean, the question is, why does the evidence we get from science place such strong restrictions on the kinds of things that can affect the spatiotemporal world? And you might well wonder. I mean, the main area where this is a hot issue is the mind-brain issue, and many philosophers are persuaded to be physicalists or materialists about the mind, including the conscious mind, largely because if they weren't, they fear they wouldn't be able to account for the ability of the conscious mind to affect other things in the spatiotemporal world, like the movements of our bodies. I mean, I mentioned epiphenomenalism in passing a while ago, but the topic we haven't looked at yet is science places very strong restrictions on what kinds of things have effects in the spatiotemporal world. Conscious properties that didn't satisfy those restrictions, i.e., were in some sense physically constituted, then wouldn't have any effects in the spatiotemporal world, and they would end up being epiphenomenal. And that's a very uncomfortable position to end up in. So that's why probably the majority of English-speaking philosophers are materialists, not only just about living bodies and the weather, but about the conscious mind.
Right. So now you're hinting toward the causal argument for physicalism about consciousness. Can you kind of run through that argument?
Well, this is a very general form of argument, and it will apply to any category of existence, any kinds of things that have effects in the spatiotemporal world. In particular, have what are uncontroversially physical effects, like moving bits of bodies, maybe moving stones, maybe, I mean, what do you move? Maybe moving a baseball bat or something. So it won't just apply to mental facts, it will also apply to social facts, to biological facts. All of these things have uncontroversially physical effects. They all affect motions of matter. So let's just do it with mental properties. But the same form of argument will apply very easily to all kinds of cases. So you start with the premise that mental occurrences have physical effects. My pain causes me to move my body. And then, and this is the interesting premise, evidence from science shows that all physical effects can be fully accounted for, insofar as they can be accounted for at all, in terms of physical causes. And then the thought is, well, it would be absurd to suppose that these physical effects, namely the motion of my body, are somehow overdetermined in the way that some guy who's shot and struck by lightning at the same time, his death is overdetermined. That can't be the right model. There aren't two separate causes for my arm going up in that way. And once you've got those three assumptions in place, first assumption tells you these effects have a mental cause. Second assumption tells you these effects have a physical cause. Third assumption, it's not the kind of case where you have two separate causes. Well, that just then implies that the mental cause just is one and the same as the physical cause. So, for instance, the pain that caused my arm to move is one and the same as the neural processing that caused my arm to move. And so that's the form of argument.
Right.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of continue dive a bit more into the mental question. But
Yeah.
this brings to mind a different example. What about everyday objects? So, for example, I throw a ball through a window, it breaks the window, and you can analyze what happened there, the causal trajectory at the level of the subatomic particles, or whatever you want to consider the elementary physical particles. Yeah. And yet at the same time, you also want to say there was a ball and the ball broke the window. And so, it seems like there might be a kind of overdetermination problem there as well.
Right, but one's quite happy to say there that the ball is nothing but all those particles so arranged. And so while it might look at first pass to the kind of unthinking everyday observer that you're talking about two separate causes, isn't it natural to say in that case that there's just one cause? And the thought will be, well, the same form of argument is going to apply here. I mean, you don't want to say the window is broken by two there weren't two causes. It wasn't like two people threw balls that hit at the same time. There was just one ball, right? And so in order not to have two separate causes, you've got to think of the ball and the particle so arranged as the same thing.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it helps to clarify what the claim is about the mind, right? So the mental experience really is just the same thing as the neurological process that's happening. And you might maybe say, when you're talking about it as a mental event, you're using a different level of description, which is what you might say about describing a ball versus describing the atoms that make up the ball.
Sure.
Now, for people who want to insist that there must be something non-physical about the mind, what are so you mentioned epiphenomenalism, then that's one. What are some of the sort of options that they go to in order to deal with that causal argument?
Well, look, think of the argument. It's got three premises, and they go through to the physicalist conclusion. So the physicalist conclusion is one option. You end up as a physicalist, right? Now, you can avoid ending up as a physicalist by denying any of those three premises. So let's go through them in turn. So one option is to deny premise one. Premise one says that mental occurrences like my conscious pain have physical effects. And you deny that, you end up with epiphenomenalism. Epiphenomenalist is somebody who says there are conscious pains distinct from physical pains, but admits that they don't have any effects. So once you do that, then you're not pushed down towards physicalism. You just deny the first premise. So my arm moving has a neural cause, and in addition, accompanying that is the conscious feeling, but the conscious feeling doesn't figure as a cause of my arm moving. I mean, a plausible position, sorry, not a plausible, a possible position, not very plausible. The first premise is, in a way, just a denial of that possibility. So if you kind of have that possibility on the table as an option, you'd need probably some more arguments to explain why we should rule it, i.e. why we should accept the first premise of the causal argument that mental occurrences have physical effects. The second premise is the interesting one. Okay. You could deny the third premise and say I'm an overdeterminationist. I think that there are physical causes for my behavior. There's also distinct mental causes. They're quite ontologically separate, but sometimes it's called the belt and braces option. You've got two causes for the same effect. You're making doubly sure that your arm goes up. I mean, and you might want to say, well, okay, what rules out that option? We need further arguments to explain what's so bad about the overdetermination's belt and braces option. But in a way, those are kind of slightly silly options, and I'm not sure I'm just trying to think hard. I'll say that there are scarcely any philosophers who really really want to run with them. Frank Jackson and David Chalmers used to think, go back 20 years, that epiphenomenalism was the right place to end up. But both of them has realized, for reasons we might go into later, that epiphenomenalism is so ugly that you don't want to end up there.
Just a question. Yeah. A question about epiphenomenalism. So, epiphenomenalism rules out the possibility that mental events can affect the physical world, but not the other way around. They admit of the possibility that the physical can create the mental.
No, to think of it like a train going along, right? The train is all the physical stuff, and there it goes along, and each stage causes the next stage of movement, and like my neurons cause my nerve signals cause my arm to move, and then there's puffs of smoke coming up as it goes along. And sure, the puffs of smoke, the conscious feelings, are caused by the brain processes, but they themselves don't then have any further effects on anything in the physical world. So that's the picture. I mean, I think the puffs of smoke is, the train going along with puffs of smoke is a very good image to understand epiphenomenalism. So sure. But look, the thing we really should be talking about is what happens if you deny premise 2, which is to say it's not true that all physical effects have physical causes. Some physical effects have distinct mental causes, i.e., think of Descartes, or think of any kind of interactionist dualist. So in addition to all the physical stuff in the world, there's also conscious mental causes. They're conscious mental events. They're distinct from the physical events, but not only does the physical world affect the mental world, but the mental world affects the physical world. And that's a long-standing and distinguished position in philosophy. I mean, Descartes had it. Other people in the 17th century disagreed with him. But I would say that most serious philosophers, there's idealists who are motivated by something different, but among the non-idealists, there's no question that interactionist dualism was the standard view until only the last 100 years or so, or even less. So a good question in this area is to ask, what's the basis for the second premise, the premise that every physical effect has a physical cause? What rules out the possibility that some physical effects have mental causes and not physical causes? When I started doing philosophy, both Karl Popper and Sir John Eccles were quite explicit in favor of the view that at certain places in the brain, independent non-physical goings-on, conscious goings-on, intervened, kind of Descartes style, and made a difference to the movement of matter in the brain. And the interesting question is what rules that out? Because that's not a view you can say, look, that's kind of slightly crazy, like epiphenomenalism. I mean, think about epiphenomenalism and the belt and braces view, is you can say, look, there's nowhere else in nature that you find a category of events that are effects of other things but don't have any effects of their own. I mean, even the puffs of smoke have some effects. They have effects on, we see them. I mean, they kind of affect the humidity of the air around, all kinds of stuff like that. But the epiphenomenalist is committed to the very strange thing that there's some things that are caused by physical goings-on but have no effects of their own at all. And that just seems theoretically very strange. It's not the kind of thing we ever find to characterize nature. And you could say the same about the belt and braces overdeterminationist view. I mean, while people sometimes build chemical plants with all kinds of fail-safe devices to make sure certain effects happen, they're overdetermined effects. It's not true that in nature there's a certain class of effect that's always overdetermined. That looks like the wrong kind of structure to find in nature. But when it comes to interactionist dualism, there's no such objection. That, I mean, there are various kinds of things in the world. There's, there's electromagnetic phenomena, gravitational phenomena, and they interact in various ways. Why shouldn't there be conscious phenomena as well? And they will interact with other kinds of things. There's nothing crazy about that. There's no list of interacting things that's kind of laid down from the start. Why do conscious causes get ruled out from the category of things that can have physical effects? So there's a question there that we haven't really looked at yet.
So so my understanding was that it's something that in the 20th century, the scientific evidence has been very essentially conclusive on that point. But
so when do you think the scientific evidence was conclusive?
I don't know.
So can I give you 5 minutes of potted history, because I think it's such an interesting story, this.
Please. Yeah.
Okay, so in the 17th century, at the birth of modern science, all the 17th century scientists that we know about, I don't know, Descartes, Locke, Newton, Leibniz, they were all mechanical philosophers. They thought that any bit of matter carried on in the same direction with the same speed until affected by impact, by another bit of matter coming and bumping into it. And give or take a bit, that really does rule out. I mean, if you say the only things that affect matter are other bits of matter moving into it, it rules out non-material things like the mind making a difference. And Leibniz argued against Descartes that his view was incoherent on just those grounds. I mean, the mind coming down and making a difference would contradict the laws of physics. And so Leibniz was in a position to run the causal argument, and he ended up not quite an epiphenomenalist or belt and braces person, but a predetermined, pre-established harmony person, which is kind of in the same line of business. But then things all changed, because Newtonian physics is very unlike the mechanical philosophy. It allows applied forces like gravity, which don't involve bits of matter bumping into each other. It involves something acting from outside on a body, kind of force field. And once Newtonians admitted gravity as a force field, they had all kinds of other force fields. They had magnetic force fields and chemical force fields and forces of cohesion, and they had vital force fields, and they had various kinds of mental force fields. If you look at the history of 18th, 19th century science, they used to argue about what different kinds of mental forces were there. There were forces of irritability and sensibility, and there was a nervous force field. And when people talked about nervous energy in the 19th century, they were talking about the potential energy of the nervous force field, which was built up in deliberation, like a elastic string getting stretched, and then when the time for action came, it was released into the kinetic energy of your bodily movement. Okay, but I'm jumping ahead a bit far, because one thing that happened in the 19th century, which hadn't been there earlier, was the establishment of the conservation of energy. So there's nothing in Newton. Newton didn't have any real conservation of energy principle. There's nothing in his laws of motion that required the conservation of energy. And so early 18th century, 19th century Newtonians were quite happy to think about these mental forces as kind of spontaneous, and they talked about the determination of the soul. They were kind of free of the rule of law. They allowed agent causation. All that was fine with the Newtonian scheme of things. Conservation of energy changes things a lot. Conservation of energy, in effect, requires all forces to be governed by strict or deterministic force laws to kind of ensure that anything they gain in potential energy is taken away in kinetic energy, and vice versa. And so once the conservation of energy was established, at that point, people realized that even if there were vital forces and the nervous force and so on, they would be governed by strict force laws. And at that point, there was a huge debate in the late 19th century about the implications of this for for free will and spontaneous action and so on. At this point, they weren't physicalists because they still had nervous forces, vital forces, and so on, forces that were peculiar to living or minded bodies. But at that stage, late 19th century, they realized that these forces had to be strictly law governed, and that was a great shock to Victorian thinkers. Some historians think that the conservation of energy was much more influential in destroying religion and traditional religious modes of thinking than the theory of evolution. It really did have a terrible impact, and so that's a point at which.
I'm sorry, just to clarify. Yeah. So the reason this is so important is that now, even if we do have these mental forces, they're going to be law governed. So now we have less room for something like freedom.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly. But it wouldn't have been then natural to call the position physicalism. I raised earlier, is a law-governed vital force field or a law-governed mental force field a physical thing just because it's law-governed? Well, it depends how you define physical. But so think of it as two stages, right? You went away from kind of libertarian free will and agent causation in two stages. First, conservation of energy, which said even if there were special force fields in living bodies and intelligent bodies, they'd have to be law governed. Very bad for free will and religion. And then, and this doesn't really happen until well into the 20th century, if you ask me, the scientific evidence came to show that not only were all forces law governed, bad enough in itself, but even stronger, they were a very restricted set of forces. Basically, they only included forces that we find in nature outside living bodies and intelligent bodies, and what's going on in living bodies and intelligent bodies is just a combination of these very general kinds of forces. But that realization, I think, came very late. I think you'll still find, I mentioned Popper and Eccles, you'll still find serious scientifically informed people in the first half of the 20th century, not yet physicalists in the modern sense, because they believed in special forces inside living and minded bodies. And I think it was just advances in understanding the machinery inside cells that stopped people believing in such forces. In particular, I think the Huxley and Hodgkin in the 50s understanding the mode of transmission of signals between neurons was very crucial. They showed how to explain it in electrochemical terms, and at that point I think people realized that there wasn't anything going on in bodies that wasn't composed of forces that you find outside bodies. And that's the point at which philosophers become physicalists, aka materialists. So, as I said, it's a two-stage thing. First of all the operative forces have to be strictly law governed, and then it turns out, what's more, they're all physical. I think the easiest way to think about physical here is composed of things that are found outside living and intelligent bodies. So that's the history of the story, and I think it's useful to put the arguments of modern physicalism in their place. The crucial premise now is the premise that said all physical effects have physical causes, and to my mind, that's a very modern premise. I don't think that was generally accepted until, say, 1950. In this connection, it's very, very striking. If you look at all the arguments from Feigl, Oppenheim, Putnam, Smart, Lewis, Armstrong, Davidson, all in the 50s and 60s arguing for physicalism, they all appeal in one way or another to the idea that all physical effects have physical causes. Right. And that premise kind of wasn't available to philosophers until that late date.
So in a way, you're saying interaction as dualism was a very attractive and intuitive position until we discover all this evidence.
Yeah. I mean, it's not something you can rule out on kind of a priori grounds of kind of nature doesn't work like that. We didn't have any evidence to show us that nature didn't work like that, and it was a very standard plausible view.
Now, I'd like to ask you if you could tell me a little bit about something I personally don't understand at all. But as I understand, some people try to use quantum mechanics as a way to get around what you just described, physical closure. Well, can you say a little bit about that?
Don't think that really helps. So I've been putting it in terms of everything is governed by the strict deterministic laws, and then more recently all physical effects are determined by prior physical causes, and that's why you've got to collapse the mind into the physical causes, because otherwise you'd have too many causes, or it would be epiphenomenal. And you might think, but quantum mechanics shows that there's certain physical effects that aren't determined by prior physical causes. Prior physical situation leaves it open whether the radium atom is going to decay or not. And you might think, well, that's great, because now that leaves a little bit of room for the mind to come in and to make a difference, to say whether certain chemical bonds break inside the brain. And there are quite a lot of people who take this possibility seriously. I had a correspondence with Alvin Plantinga, who was interested in whether this offered a route to evade the argument for physicalism. So
I know I've heard Chalmers talk about it. I don't know that he ever subscribed to it, but I know he entertained it.
It doesn't really run very well, because, look, according to quantum mechanics, the prior physical situation doesn't determine the outcomes like breaking of chemical bonds and so on. But it does determine the probabilities of those things happening. It says, there's a 70% chance the bond will break and a 30% chance it doesn't. But every time we have this prior physical circumstance, those are the probabilities. And that's in itself enough to preclude a non-physical mental cause making a difference. Suppose you had the non-physical mental cause, right? I'm kind of deciding in the non-physical realm to move my arm, and I'm going to do this by somehow the mental realm coming down and breaking certain chemical bonds. And suppose that the physical circumstances are the ones that set the probability 70 or 30. And now there's cases where I come in and try and break the bond, and cases where I don't. And presumably, if my non-physical mental decision is really making a difference, it's going to change the probabilities. It's going to mean that in those physical circumstances, plus my decision, then there's a 90% chance or 100% chance the bond will break. But that's to say that the physical circumstances don't fix a 70% chance for the bond breaking, and that's inconsistent with quantum mechanics. And so if you're going to suppose that quantum mechanics says that the physical circumstances involving only the fundamental force fields of gravity, electromagnetism, nuclear forces, those circumstances fix the probabilities by themselves, and that doesn't leave any room for anything else to come in and make a difference to the probabilities. So you can run the causal argument in probabilistic terms. The gaps left by quantum mechanical indeterminism, quantum mechanics says nothing else fills them either. I mean, quantum mechanics says these are definitely the chances. It doesn't say these are the chances until somebody comes along to try and intervene from outside the physical realm.
In this sort of area of discussion of the routes that people take to get around this, I often hear discussed panpsychism. This idea that everything has some In what way is this, as far as you know, in what way is this supposed to deal with the causal argument, if at all?
Okay, so no, I haven't talked about that yet because there's a bunch of different options in that area: panpsychism, neutral monism, Russellian monism, proto-panpsychism. We can talk about them a bit, but at first pass, they agree with all the three premises of the causal argument, and so end up with something which crudely is kind of in the same ballpark as physicalism. So here's how the panpsychist or Russellian monist position works. And it involves a view about laws and properties that nothing much to do with what we talked about so far. So here's a pretty standard position, that there's various properties in the actual world, say masses, electric charge, and so on. And they have their nature as properties. And then it's a further question, not decided by their nature of properties, what laws they're going to enter into. So this is a kind of Humean view. It's a contingent matter once you've got certain properties, what laws they're going to enter into. Now, so you could think of, you observe a certain world and it's got a certain kind of network of laws, accelerations proportional to forces. Forces can involve gravitational force, electrical charge. Accelerations inversely proportional to mass, and so you've got this network of laws. And then there's a further question: which properties, as it were, occupy the nodes in this network of laws? So you can think of the laws as giving you the kind of dispositional facts, the kind of the pattern of co-occurrence of different properties. And then there's a further question which is to do with the categorical facts, which property natures underlie those dispositions. What are the categorical basis for the tendency of bodies to resist acceleration to the extent they do? So you could imagine two different worlds which kind of displayed the same pattern of laws, but in one world the property nature was one thing, mass. In another world, the bodies all had a different categorical basis, smash or something, but the pattern of laws was the same. So the idea here is that any set of dispositions about the tendency of bodies to interact with each other need to be kind of filled out by categorical bases, the actual nature of the properties that underlie the dispositions. And so Russellian monists say, well, physics gives us all the behavior of bodies and interactions, but it doesn't tell us about the nature of the properties that underlie those dispositions. And then the thought is that there's one place where we have access to these natures. There's one place where we know about the properties that underlie the physical dispositions. And that's in our awareness of our own conscious minds. So there we discover, at least in our brains, that the properties that play, say, the neural pain role or the neural vision role have a certain conscious nature. So the patterns of behavior displayed by physics and neuroscience and so on is one thing, and then the properties that underlie that, they're the conscious feelings. So that's Russellian monism, and then the panpsychist thought can be motivated in different ways, but one standard way is look here, at least in conscious introspection, that's the one place we're in contact with the underlying categorical nature of reality as opposed to the pattern of behavior that bodies display. And there we define that the underlying nature is conscious. So perhaps we should suppose that the underlying nature of all the patterns that we observe in the world is conscious, that all the behaviors that science tells us about is underpinned by some kind of conscious nature, even in stones and weather and so on. So that's the position. And it doesn't deny any of the premises of the causal argument, really. It's got conscious properties as the categorical bases of the neural behavior in the brain. Those things enter into causes, all right. We don't have anything going on that's coming from outside the fundamental forces described by science. No overdetermination, no epiphenomenalism. But there's this appeal to the metaphysics of properties and laws, which allows you to say that underneath the surface behavior described by science, there are categorical bases, and some of them are conscious. So, I mean, it's an interesting question how far this is a non-physicalist position.
It sounds like it is. It sounds like it's physicalism and saying that it is a part of the physical to have a kind of conscious component, to put it very roughly.
Well, you could be a Russellian monist and not a panpsychist. You could say, I don't think that the bases of all the patterns of behavior observed in the world are conscious, but in some rather complex cases, the kind of patterns of behavior we get inside brains, then the bases of those complexes are conscious. That's a perfectly natural position, and it's not clear how that differs from orthodox physicalism, at least to the extent the orthodox physicalist will accept that this picture of there being patterns of behavior, and then a further fact about what underlying properties provide the categorical basis for those patterns. But if orthodox physicalist goes along with that, it looks to me like their position will not be very different from the Russellian monist.
So I just want to make sure that I understand this about the underlying categorical basis.
Yeah.
Is this supposed to be something about the nature of the physical itself? Is that the idea? Right? That we can take for granted
sure.
Relationships and forces and patterns of behavior, but yeah. what is undetermined is the nature of the stuff itself, so to speak.
Let's put it in slightly different terms. I mean, I said it already. I mean, on this view, there are two different possible worlds. Let's suppose the actual world, and let's suppose that in the actual world, the behavior of ordinary material bodies in response to forces depends on their mass. So there's this pattern of behavior, bodies show certain resistance to acceleration, and the thought is underlying that resistance is the fact that they have this categorical property, mass. And then there's another possible world where everything looks just the same, but there's a different categorical property underlying the similar surface behavior. So that's the idea. So the surface behavior hasn't yet decided all the facts. It's the further fact about what provides a categorical basis for these patterns of behavior. Now, I myself think this is a very, very unattractive metaphysics. I think that the categorical bases are kind of danglers that are doing no explanatory work in this story. But it's a pretty widely accepted story, and once you accept that story, then there's room to say that it's a categorical basis that constitutes the consciousness and not the patterns of behavior per se. But I don't think one should think of this as a way of evading the causal argument so much as
as a way of, it seems like a way of kind of glossing the conclusion of the causal argument in such a way as to give some solace, some satisfaction to people who think that the world as described by science leaves out the important thing, the conscious feelings. And the idea is the world as described by science just describes the surface patterns. There's this further underlying thing, which science doesn't really get at, doesn't tell us whether we're in the mass world or the smash world, and that's the thing that constitutes the feelings. So if you feel that the feelings kind of take us beyond what science tells us about, this is a way of giving substance to that thought. Yeah, it seems like a part of what's motivating this, and I think it's kind of something that we should probably address, is the concern that qualia, subjective experience, are being left unaccounted for. So can we actually talk about that? As a physicalist, what is your response to the qualia objection to Mary's room, that world of objections? And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Next week, in the second half of this conversation, David and I discuss how physicalism accounts for the existence of qualia and subjective experience. Specifically, we'll cover arguments surrounding the famous Mary's Room thought experiment. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.